I wish to engage people, to have people reflect on history, but also on the now. Colonial structures are still ongoing. It's right now in so many ways that we have kind of adapted it, and this is also what my work is about, trying to reveal these structures and de-link from these structures. I was born in Denmark to a Danish mother and a Trinidadian father. Being raised in Denmark and being almost always the only black person in the room, of course you get used to it, but when I started dealing with the colonial history, there were so many things that kind of occurred to me, came back to me. It kind of opened up a source inside me of experience of being black in a predominantly white society. It opened up for a lot of like suppressed feelings and suppressed experiences. And it was like a bodily feeling for me, as well as an intellectual feeling, because I could kind of grapple with it, deal with it through my art. And that was a great way for me to trying to understand my place in this world. I think in my early teens, or late teens actually, I was really drawn to painting and drawing. So I actually wanted to become a painter at some point. However, when I started at the academy, I realized that there are a lot of much better painters than myself. So I decided to do something else. And then I decided to work with video and photos. I used the eraser tool from Photoshop. For instance, I took some found footage of a soccer match and then I erased all the soccer players, so it was only the ball and the shadows left. These were like early sketches and early explorations, investigations of what does it mean to, if you erase something, like something very important, what does it mean? In 2008, I was in Ghana, visiting a good friend of mine who lived in Ghana at that point. And I experienced reminiscence of Denmark's colonial history right there. It was the Danish forts, the dungeons where they kept the enslaved Africans before they deported them over the Atlantic to the New World. And that whole part of Danish history was unknown to me. Denmark was a colonizer of the Virgin Islands, which were former Danish Virgin Islands, for more than 200 years, and built up this new world with plantation systems where enslaved Africans created a lot of goods like liquor and coffee and sugar. Of course, sugar is a big thing, and from these goods we gained a lot of wealth. We also had stations, territories in Africa, where the Europeans traded weapons for people, for enslaved Africans that they deported to the New World, the Americas. So that's the thing. It's a very brutal story that our society is based on. To express my newfound encounter with this part of history, it made so much sense to use that tool of erasure, because that was what I experienced, that part of history was erased in my consciousness. I made a video where I'm dancing and I have erased myself so you could only see my kind of ghostly silhouette. It speaks about the past that is still there and it's still part of our history, but erased from history. The colonial history has been erased from a Danish collective memory. So it was like, in that sense, it was very simple. But it also speaks to what it means when you enslave someone, because you erase everything. You erase names, you erase family, you erase traditions, language, everything. I had photographed some children on the beach in Ghana, and I photographed them walking into the ocean. I erased the children, but still you could see their reflection in the shoreline. To erase something, of course, is also a very violent act, but it's like a subtle way to talk about it. I also started researching my own region here in Copenhagen, and soon realized that it's everywhere. You see the traces of the slave trade everywhere. The Royal Cask Collection is a very important place in Denmark and in Danish colonial history. And it's a place that I have been returning to many times because it has so much. It's loaded with history, and it's a museum. It speaks to art history, but it also speaks to our colonial history. So the Royal Cask Collection was built as the West Indian Warehouse in the 1700s. It was built to store the goods that came from the Virgin Islands to Denmark, like sugar and rum and all of these things, that were distributed out in Denmark. So it has this major importance into our history. So the collection has been here since the 80s, but the collection is from the 1800s. It was a thing back then to order these copies of these old masterpieces. Of course, they are white because they are made of plaster, but it's also a statement because they need to represent the pureness and the white gaze and white culture. So this sculpture goes way back in my trajectory. Before I became a professional artist, I took an artist course in the early 90s, and it was like a very traditional course where we're like drawing after nudes and sculptures. And we actually went here in this space, and I remember making a drawing of this sculpture by Michelangelo. It's an enslaved person. It must have been from the 1500s. Yeah, so before the transatlantic enslavement trade. So since I was quite young, I came here not knowing about the history behind this space. So it's like quite interesting that I years later end up having this very deep connection with this space and with this collection of sculptures, but from a very different perspective. So this is actually a piece of mine. It's an African proverb. It says, "Until the lion has their historian, the hunter will always be a hero." You can't see the last word because somebody destroyed it. I took a photo of that quote in the Danish slave fort in Ghana, and then I copied it onto the wall here. Just to have this in the back of my mind all the time, to like maybe being that historian that is telling the history of the lion. Yeah, of reconnecting these buildings and reconnecting history. When I realized how deeply involved in the colonial history this building is, I decided to make my performance Whip It Good inside of the building because it really, really matched what I was trying to express so well within these walls. It's a live performance where I'm dressed in white and I have a white body paint. And I also have a whip, which I dip into crushed charcoal. It's kind of a wake-up call, in a way, for myself, but also for my audience to show the brutality of the colonial system, but also to show it in a very brutal way. I use the tool of the master, but I use it in a twisted version. I've been talking about erasure a lot, and then at some point I started focusing more about the resistance, because there has been a lot of resistance within Black history, of course, since like the beginning of this project, the Colonial project. A lot of enslaved Africans, of course, have resisted this brutal system. So I started looking more into that, and then also my works started changing, because that's how I felt. I had to kind of just like manifest this history, so we won't forget it again. We won't forget about this part of our history. And that's also the I Am Queen Mary project. It's a huge manifest, a huge statement of Black history and of Black presence and representation. I mean, we don't have any sculptures of Black people in Denmark, really. Maybe only a few, but not of a Black female resistance figure. I Am Queen Mary is a project that I made together with the artist Lavon Bell, who is from the Virgin Islands, St. Croix. I Am Queen Mary refers to Queen Mary, a woman who led the Fireburn revolt. Her name was Mary Thomas, and she was a worker in the plantation system in St. Croix. And she, together with 3 other queens, were leading the labor revolt. It's one of the first and the biggest labor revolt in Denmark, because it was Danish territory at that point. And in the Virgin Islands, she's a very, very important figure, of course, because of her fierce personality. And in Denmark, we have no knowledge about her. So it felt so urgent to put forward her legacy and her history and her narrative, and other queens, of course, too. So Lavon Bell and I, we started working together. So we were body scanned, and this designer created a completely new woman. So it became this merging project of bodies, of narratives, and of nations. It was made as a temporary version because we were not able to raise enough money, and we had a very, very heavy winter storm in 2020, and it completely damaged the figure. There's a smaller version in Barnard College in the States, in New York, and we also have a small version in Copenhagen, but we still want to make the big ones. Our dream is to have a permanent version in front of the warehouse in Copenhagen, as we initiated already, and then to have a sister sculpture in St. Croix, also by the harbor front. So we have these two sculptures belonging to the same history on each side of the Atlantic. A lot of my work speaks to the African diaspora, and it also speaks about the Middle Passage, the notion of spreading a people, scattering people all over the world, pulling people apart. Families were pulled apart. Yeah. And so I'm going to show you the video where I introduced Moko Jumbi to a Danish audience. The myth says that Moko walked from West Africa to the Caribbean, across the Atlantic Ocean on stilts to take care of its people. So it's a healing spirit, and it's a very important character in the Caribbean, and during carnival times you would see a lot of Moko Jumbis kind of roaming around. For this video I wanted Moko to cross the Atlantic again, but now embarking in Copenhagen in the harbor, to kind of heal the colonial wound, but also to take care of its people here. I had a period of time where I was very confrontational in my work, because that's how I felt. I had to use that perspective, or that was a way for me to make a statement. Now I'm more like spiritually engaged. My work revolves more around the spirituality of the Black history. The braids are very important. I've been using braids and hair for some time now as the main material in my work. Hair has always been very important to African cultures, or within Black culture. It's been policed a lot, but it's also been a way to make a survival strategy. So I've used hair as a tool for talking about our connection to colonial history. I've had this performance where we're having like long, very long braids that were tied to colonial buildings, and we're kind of walking back and forth for several hours with our braids tied to the building. I've been making a performance where we're performers from the African diaspora tied together. So kind of speaking about the diasporic relation, our links and our situation being part of colonial history, and fighting against it, struggling with it, but also being tied to it, sometimes as a positive, you know, a sisterhood, for instance, solidarity. I've always been performing in one way or another. I have a background in my childhood as a gymnast and also as a dancer. So I have this experience and this way of navigating, I guess, with my body and, you know, in life. So last year I was contacted by a woman. She's a dancer and a choreographer, professor in dance and choreography, who in her introducing email mentioned that she thinks she's my sister. We share the same father. And that she found me online. She found me through my art. And of course I was, you know, over the moon about this new relation. So we started emailing and speaking, and then I was invited to do a project, a collaborative project between a dance institution and a visual art institution in Copenhagen. So I asked her if she would be willing to collaborate with me for this project, and if she would be willing to produce a performance for me, or a choreography for me. And she agreed.
Can you see my feet now?
Yeah.
They're ugly and they're gnarly dancer's feet, but anyway, what you're gonna do is,
they look great.
With your toes and your heels together, you're gonna...
So my sister is in the States and we still haven't met. She would perform it, or she would show it to me on Zoom, and I would try to do the different movements and to imitate her. She's been standing in her living room. I'm standing in my living room, and then sometimes you can only see the feet, sometimes you can only see the hands, and you know, it's like, it's very difficult. But
D, ha, D. Take the right foot, push like you're gonna stomp, but push yourself off the ground to jump.
It's also been a lot of fun, and it feels very important too.
It's like a scream.
Okay.
Does that make sense? It's not a big jump.
Okay.
But yeah. It's a forceful jump.
My sister and I, we're from the same history, from the same trajectory, and our meeting now speaks to that we have been pulled apart for so long. And my piece, Diasporic Frequencies, also speaks to that. I'm tied in a lot of long braids in a barn, and then I'm doing a choreography that was created by my sister.
The war is the same, If we lose.
The poem is by Audre Lorde, the African-American activist and poet. It's called At the Edge of Each Other's Battles, and it speaks to solidarity between women from the African diaspora.
Someday, women's blood will congeal on a dead planet. Will congeal on a dead planet. Will congeal.
It speaks about how our struggles are, of course, different, but the same, but also of solidarity to the earth that we live on, to the planet that we are destructing.
And the end of each other's battle.
The brutal ways the colonial system behaves towards the world and the planet and some of the people who live on the planet. These colonial structures are still dominant. The global inequality The police brutality is part of that same system. The history is like in our bones, in our blood, in everywhere. This is what we're dealing with. And that's what I'm trying to explore and to connect to and disconnect from at the same time in my work.
There is no telling